Hi, I'm Loren Roosendaal, and in this episode of Transformed, we'll be looking at attention span. Now, when it comes to learning, attention span is really important and often misunderstood. I often say when you're trying to teach someone something, it's kind of like placing a funnel at the top of their head and pouring in the knowledge. Now, we know when you're dealing with a funnel that they have a limited capacity. So if you keep on pouring, that knowledge is going to go anywhere but where you want it to go. And there is a lot of research on attention span. And although there is a lot of contention, and it is truly possible if you are indeed a magnificent teacher, a great public speaker, to stretch people's attention span for a long period of time with the right techniques, the reality is that on average, an adult has an attention span of some 15 to 20 minutes to spend, which is why, for example, TED Talks home in on this sort of sweet spot of maximum 18 to 20 minutes. And yet, if you think about that as being the sort of base level of a human's attention span, it is very strange to think about what we're doing when it comes to learning. Because what we're doing is we're putting people into a classroom and we're setting them down there for hours on end, sometimes an entire day. Or, we're hip and with the new technology and we're doing e-learning at our company, and then we send people this e-learning module, which they spend 2 hours of an evening clicking through. And it has absolutely disastrous effects on our learning. Now, you might wonder, how disastrous are those effects? Well, in one of my favorite studies, which was conducted at an American university, they did this great experiment where they basically came up with a completely imaginary African country. And they took 2 groups of students and they made an hour's worth of educational material about this completely imaginary country. And then they taught it to those two groups of students. And the beauty of it is, this was knowledge they couldn't possibly have because everything was made up. So everyone started with 0% knowledge. And then what they did is they gave it to one group in the form of a 1-hour lecture. Whereas the other group, they simply said, okay, let's cut this lecture into 3 20-minute parts and see what the difference is going to be. Now, after about a week after that lecture, they tested both groups to see how much of the knowledge from that lecture they would have retained. And it turned out the group that got the 1-hour lecture, they ended up retaining 18% of the knowledge that they had received in that lecture, which is crazy. Less than 1/5 of what they got taught they remembered. And then the group that got those blocks of 20 minutes with ample time in between, that group ended up retaining 58% of what was taught. That's more than 3 times the amount of knowledge retained from a lesson simply by paying attention to someone's attention span. And this is a really, really crazy and vast difference that you can create by knowing this principle and knowing how to deal with it. What does that mean? Well, it means that if you're putting people into a classroom for, let's say, an hour, 2 hours, know what you're doing. Realize that unless you are absolutely fantastic, you won't be able to perfectly hold their attention for that whole period. Understand that there's limited spans of attention. Use humor, use emotion. Allow people to take a little break every now and then. Get a breather, right? This is a very funny notion, but people oftentimes don't even realize how bad, for example, just a classroom setting is. If you go into a classroom and you basically fill that classroom up with people, because that's what we're trying to do, right? Teach as many people with as little assets as possible. And then something silly happens, which is all these people are breathing, right? So the air obviously fills it with more carbon dioxide. And you might say, well, I've never really noticed that. Or you might say, well, actually, I realized that when I'm at some lecture, people start yawning all the time. Yeah, it's not because the lecture is necessarily boring, though that may be a good reason. No, there's a lack of oxygen in the air. In fact, research from an American university, I believe it was Berkeley, recently showed that if you have a raise to 2,500 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the air, the impact on people's capability to pay attention and learn is actually similar to having a blood alcohol level of 0.8, which is the legal driving limit in the US. So basically what we're saying is we're inebriating people so badly by putting them in a classroom for just that attention span plus of them, that just through being in the classroom they're basically already inebriated and unable to pay attention, let alone the fact that we're essentially putting them into a position of having to pay attention for a really long time span. So in terms of attention span, what's key to know? Well, first of all, we're not paying proper attention to it, right? Know that people have a limited attention span. Keep it in mind. One of the best ways to deal with it is just 2-3 minutes of distraction, no more, no less, in between every 15 to 20 minutes of teaching people something, whether that's online or in a classroom or in any other way. So keep that in mind. But as we continue along on this journey, it's just good to keep in the back of your head that with just one principle of learning covered, we've already ended up in a situation where simply by not honoring people's attention spans nowadays, we are losing up to 2/3 of our learning efficiency every single day. And that is a pretty harsh thought to live with. And at this point, you might be thinking, well, how can it get any worse? Well, don't worry, because in the next episode, we're going to be looking at how we're matching what we're teaching people to their capabilities. And you will see that it does indeed get a lot worse. So, if you want to stay up to date, be sure to subscribe and like and follow this channel.